The world of sports, particularly American sports, as is well known, there's such a thing as the Most Valuable Player Award. And that, of course, goes to the player or group of players who've made the biggest contribution to the team. And I'm going to tell you about two studies that we conducted in Australia that suggest that in the world of business, employees are the most valuable stakeholder group. The two studies were actually conducted 6 years apart. The first study was undertaken in 2004, but this particular aspect of it hasn't been published before. And the second study was conducted in 2010, so there's an opportunity to make a comparison over a 6-year time frame. And the key finding is that employee orientation contributes more to CFP, corporate financial performance, than orientation towards any other individual stakeholder group. And that includes shareholders, suppliers, the community, and even customers. Now, of course, there has been prior research on the impact of employee orientation on corporate financial performance, but the results have been rather mixed. Some studies have said, yes, employee orientation contributes positively to financial performance. Others have found different results. And I think it's useful to examine the reasons why there have been conflicting research results in the past. I think the first and most important reason is that there's quite a lot of confusion about what employee orientation actually is. And in particular, employee orientation can get mixed up with two other concepts. Firstly, corporate social responsibility, and I'm going to argue that employee orientation is most certainly compatible with corporate social responsibility, but it is not synonymous with CSR. And then the second area of confusion has been to equate employee orientation with specific human resource management or human resource development practices. And I think, as I will explain, that has also been a source of confusion. Not going to say much about this point, except to note that another reason for the conflicting research in the past is that people have used different methodological approaches. So some people have relied quite heavily on secondary data. Other people have used survey research. We used survey research. And for various reasons, which I won't go into now, I think that is a better approach. And a third reason is that studies have been conducted in different countries, some studies in China, some in Western countries. So our research questions are quite simply, what is the impact of adopting employee orientation on corporate financial performance? And how does the impact of employee orientation differ from orientation towards other primary stakeholder groups? Now, as I was saying, some studies have framed research in the past in terms of corporate social responsibility. One of the main difficulties with this is that if you look at the research on the impact of corporate social responsibility on financial performance, one finding has been that stakeholder-related CSR impacts positively on CFP, corporate financial performance, but non-stakeholder-related CSR doesn't necessarily have that effect. So I think that's been one reason for conflicting research findings in the past. So as I was saying, our position is that employee orientation is certainly compatible with corporate social responsibility, but it's not exactly the same thing. Now with HRM, there's been a lot of studies in the human resources literature on the impact of various human resource practices on firm performance. Two main schools of thought have emerged, which we could call a best fit or a contingent school of thought versus a best practice school of thought. And really the best fit school seems to be the one that's best supported by the evidence. So the suggestion is that various human resource practices may or may not have a beneficial effect on corporate financial performance, depending on the culture and the type of organisation. So I think that's quite an important point. And also, if you look in the HR literature, you will discover that human resource practices and what we call employee orientation are in fact separate constructs, and it's a mistake to confuse them. One study, Kuvas 2008, found that in fact what he called employee organization relations, which is very similar to what we mean by employee orientation, actually moderates the relationship between HR practices and performance, so that there's only a positive relationship between HR practices and organizational performance when the employee-organization relationship, or what we call employee orientation, is high. So I think it's a mistake to use HR practices as a proxy for employee orientation. So our first study had 235 businesses respond, and we conceptualized employee orientation in terms of dialogue with the dimensions of listening, positive regard, and willingness to change. The second study had 201 responses, and we conceptualized employee orientation in terms of employee concern. And this is one dimension of a newly developed scale of what we're calling corporate social responsibility branding. And these are the formal hypotheses, which basically restate the research questions in slightly more formal language. Obviously the main one being that engaging in dialogical communication with employees is positively associated with corporate financial performance. That was for the first study. And then for the second study, that employee concern is positively associated with corporate financial performance. When we get to the findings, we did the data analysis using confirmatory factor analysis and structural equation modeling using Amos 18. And in the first study, we found that shareholder orientation and stakeholder orientation together accounted for a pretty big proportion of the variance in corporate financial performance, 14%. But when we analyze that, we see that in fact overall stakeholder orientation is making a much bigger contribution to corporate financial performance than shareholder orientation. And then when we break down stakeholder orientation and we say which orientations are carrying the most weight, we see that top of the league table is employee orientation, well out in front, followed by supplier, customer, and community orientations, which are about equal, and then shareholder orientation makes a very minor contribution to stakeholder orientation. And then when we directly compare employee with shareholder orientation, we find that employee orientation is making a bigger impact, so we can therefore conclude that hypotheses 1 and 2 are supported. When we come to the second study, we find that what we're calling CSR branding accounts for a very big chunk of the variance in corporate financial performance. These are certainly not trivial results, 20% of the variance. And once again, employee concern is out there at the top of the ladder, ahead of the other dimensions of CSR branding. So again, there is evidence to support hypotheses 3 and 4. So what we hope that we've done with this study, from a theoretical point of view, is to clarify the employee orientation construct. And this is essentially about the spirit in which employees are engaged. It's not about specific human resource techniques. And we're going to make a bold claim. We're going to argue that it is universally applicable. It's not contingent. From a managerial point of view, it's a pretty simple message. Engage your employees, pay attention to your employees, and you'll make more money. And because we're not talking about specific HR techniques, we argue that public relations is the area best placed to facilitate this. Of course, with any research, there are limitations. We did do this study in Australia, so particularly to support that claim that these findings have a universal applicability, we need to replicate this study in other cultures, in other settings. And I think there's also the potential for different methodological approaches, particularly a qualitative or perhaps a case study approach to further elaborate on these findings. And that's it. Thank you very much.